received by other MPs when they spread misinformation and lies and make personal attacks against other members. This has been my case and the case of many of my colleagues. One example was in 2018 when Conservative MP Rachel Thomas used her House of Commons budget, which was taxpayer dollars, to send a mailer to every household in my riding with the headline that said, quote, MP Pam Demoff fails to stand up for victims of rape and sex trafficking, and Pam Demoff chooses ISIS over women and girls. The first line of this mailer basically claims, quote, the current government is committed to welcoming ISIS terrorists back to Canada, end quote. We often hear Conservative MPs carelessly and baselessly using terms like corrupt and treason in Parliament and in their social media posts. Following Conservative MPs Michael Barrett, Michael Cooper, Larry Brock, and Damien Currick accusing government members of the Ethics Committee of being corrupt, and MP Barrett accusing me personally of being involved in a cover-up, Conservative MPs posted our email addresses on social media, encouraged the public to contact us. As a result, my staff had to create a misogyny subfolder in my inbox, and some of the messages that I received as a result were, and I'm going to quote with all of these, you are one sleazy effing lying C-word. Enough is enough of you effing lying pieces of shit. How do you sleep? I know your ex-husband sleeps well now that he got rid of you. Resign from the party, resign from Oakville. You disgusting piece of shit. Nice legacy. Pathetic losers, you need to go to jail. You bitches are effed. You are an effing traitor. Get the F out of Canada before we deal with you properly. You are a treasonous piece of garbage. These are all different messages, by the way. It's not the same one. You are a treasonous piece of garbage. You should be in prison for supporting the destruction of our country and people. You are a criminal. Another one said, your beloved boss is going to stand in front of the Nuremberg tribunals, as should all of you. You disgusting, pathetic, Satanist-worshipping humans, and you're all finished. And then the last one, you are an arrogant, elite, and unhinged bitch. You're going to rot in maximum security when the revolution comes. I suggest you step down now while you can, traitor. While I have been the target of the gun lobby for many years and received far more than just mean tweets, as they call them, I want to give another specific example of an MP's comments directly causing an influx of hate through social media, emails, and phone calls. During clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-21, Conservative MP Blaine Calkins posted a video accusing me of equating hunters with the Danforth shooter, which I absolutely did not. As a result of his video, some of the threats and abuse that I immediately got were, quote, you stupid C-word, it's up to the government to justify taking away legal property, not the person to keep it, and fear is not a justification. I hope and pray to God that you will die a horrible, painful death, and your family too, because you and your genes are a piece of shit and need to be removed from the planet. Come on, God, answer my prayer. She is a liberal whore and a waste of human skin. Another one said, in medieval times, this would be considered treason and it would be off with your head and hung from the gates. Another one, well, look at this lying liberal sack of shit. Go F yourself. Pam, go F yourself, Pam, preferably with this semi-automatic assault rifle dildo and with an accompanying photo that he sent. And then the last one, even if you sucked my cock, I wouldn't vote for you. While I report explicit threats of violence towards me to police, they often say they don't cross the line for them to do anything. I note that the RCMP Commissioner recently said we should look at giving police additional tools and legislation to adequately respond to threats against politicians, and I believe he's testifying before the committee, and I look forward to his testimony. I agree with those arguing that a healthy dose of partisanship and criticism of the government are inherent to this place and have always been core tenets of Parliament and a healthy democracy. But what I have experienced and what many other parliamentarians and our staff have experienced does not constitute legitimate criticism of government policy, nor a healthy debate of ideas. I'm deeply worried about our Parliament and our democracy should this continue unabated. And while it may be difficult to control the words and conduct of others, I believe it is our collective responsibility as parliamentarians to set the tone and an example through how we interact and debate with each other, and to rise above personal attacks and hostility. At minimum, we need to call out inappropriate behavior in our own political parties and a harassment and abuse by MPs towards other MPs. I'm heartened by the Halton women elected representatives who recently signed a public pledge to stand up for one another and to call on police to do more to combat abuse and threats towards elected officials. Parliamentarians are called to conduct our work with civility, compassion, and respect. Respect for each other, for our position, for our office, for the legislative process, and for the institution of Parliament and Canadians. It is not lost on me how the difficult challenges that we face, the issues we have to overcome, and divisions we have to heal. However, I believe Canada can represent the best in each of us if we as parliamentarians do our part. I want to again thank the committee for the opportunity to appear today, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Madame Dama, for sharing some very difficult experiences with us. Ms. Khalid, the floor is yours for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, for inviting me to appear before the PROC Procedure and House Affairs Committee today to speak about the review of the members of the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy. I apologize in advance if my voice shakes today. It will shake, but it will not be silenced. I will not be bullied. I will not be intimidated. I will continue to represent my constituents to the best of my ability. Mr. Chair, I want to begin by acknowledging the brave woman sitting beside me on this panel, MP Pam Dumoff, who has done so much to bring the issue of harassment and threats of members of Parliament, particularly women, to the forefront of the conversation that is so critically important to speak about right now. And it's important because it is literally the core value of our democracy here as Canadians. Are we able to disagree without being disagreeable? Are we going to save what democracy looks like for our younger generations coming forward? If we are not able to stop the harassment of each other in the name of partisan politics, we are not going to survive as a democracy. Our next generation is going to be completely disengaged, disenfranchised, and will have no trust in democratic institutions at all. And I think that this is very, very vital for us to recognize. I had a class of constituents last week, 2 weeks ago, up in the gallery, and they watched Question Period. And when I met with them after they had experienced that, the first question that one of the young girls said to me, she asked, "Is it always this violent in there? How do you do it? Why do you do it?" And my answer to her was, because somebody needs to. We need to make sure that we are having positive, constructive discourse with one another so that we can represent and support Canadians as they deserve. We are elected, all 338 of us, in our ridings by the people, the communities that live there. We represent them. And, Mr. Chair, I am embarrassed by how our conduct is deteriorating the very values that we stand for. And I do have a few examples for you today, Mr. Chair. Have you ever been called a racial slur for just doing your job? Have you been called a terrorist casually as if it were your name? Have you ever been spat on before? I have. Somebody once said to me, "I want to fuck you gently with a chainsaw." Imagine the violence, the thought of it even, to utter those thoughts and make it public, put it on record. How do people feel that they have the entitlement to do that? Harassment for me has not been new. I've been elected as a member of parliament for 9 years, and it has been from day one. But I will highlight a few of the incidents specific to this topic of MPs harassing each other and creating, for me in particular, life-threatening situations. In 2017, I had tabled Motion 103 in the House, which was a motion to combat all types of systemic racism and religious discrimination, including Islamophobia, in our country. It was an attempt to build bridges between communities. Unfortunately, there was a conservative leadership race that was ongoing at the time, and the members of that leadership race started to, through the use of alt-right media, first off, legitimize a concept that I was bringing in Sharia law into the country, and that this was not a non-binding motion, but a first step, a bill, which was quite wrong and very false and maliciously false. These emails were circulated across the country. They were used to raise fundraising dollars for conservative candidates in that conservative leadership race. The end result was multiple death threats, which were investigated by police. Police were stationed outside of my house for weeks. My staff were harassed to the point where we had to lock our office doors. We received over 90,000 emails in my inbox, preventing me from doing any of my other constituency work. All of that happened because conservative MPs running for leadership felt that this was a plug. The politics of agitation is not helpful to how we conduct ourselves as Canadians and as parliamentarians. We need to put Canadians first and foremost. As I said, I've received, other than the verbal abuse, death threats, including from a gentleman inviting me to become acquainted with his rifle, and another who told me that I would be hanged, another who released my address on a radio talk show to say, go kill her. I would happily film it if you go kill her. When MPs target each other on social media, when the politics of agitation gets pushed by right-wing media, we are doing indirectly what we cannot do directly according to the House of Commons rules. We are bullying and intimidating each other for partisan politics, and that is not fair to Canadians at all. We embarrass ourselves in front of Canadians. We can dance around the antics of social media posts all we want, but the intent of these social media posts, of sending letters like my colleague MP Pam Dumoff received in her writing, it is harassment, and we need to do something about it. As I've said, many Conservative members, and not all of them, including the now leader of the opposition, have done similar things to target individual members of Parliament, to bully and to harass and to silence. And what that has done is that it has divided communities now more than ever, and some communities more than others. There are real-world consequences when members of Parliament decide to fundraise and get clicks off of dehumanizing others with insults and with attacks. And I'm not the only target. Just this past week, we heard from the Sergeant of Arms, who testified at PROC, that the harassment of MPs, especially online, has increased by about 700 to 800%. This is not new, and this should not be normalized. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, there must be room in Canada for people to legitimately criticize their elected representatives, their policies, and their positions to further the productive democratic discourse in this country. There must also be room for members of Parliament to engage in discourse, for the opposition to do its job, and for the government to do theirs. What we are seeing, however, are the boundaries being blurred with intimidation, harassment, and outright threats and violence layered with misogyny against us as parliamentarians to prevent us from fulfilling our duties to our constituents. There must be a clear distinction and boundary between legitimate criticism and outright harassment that is made clear in your forthcoming study and report in the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy, specifically between members of Parliament, and specifically when it comes to women and our unique experiences. Let me say, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Chair, that people are watching. Canadians are watching us, and we need to do better. We need to make sure that there is respect in this place, because if we don't respect each other, how can we expect Canadians to respect each other? How can we continue to build bridges amongst each other? And how can we stand for a democracy that is built on respect? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms. Khaled. Colleagues, I just want to check with the witnesses quickly. If, given the nature and the sensitivity of the topic, do you feel ready to go right into a line of questioning, or would? Okay. With that, Ms. Rempel-Garner, you will begin our first round with 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to say, based on personal experience, that the type of language that you both have been subjected to by members of the public, it's unacceptable, right? I think that's something that we all can agree on. And I think the question now is, how do we move forward? So, as a member of the opposition, it is my job to hold the government to account. And so for me, when I come into the House of Commons sometimes, and I've asked the Prime Minister questions, I will state a fact that's in a report, and then he'll stand up in the House of Commons and say that I'm spreading misinformation. So how are we, because you've both had good suggestions. You've said that we need to allow for room for legitimate criticism of the government. But how can we do that when we have a Prime Minister who stands up over and over again, and many of the ministry as well, when there's a legitimate concern, rather than defending the policy, or it's just there's misinformation, Conservatives are spreading misinformation, and do you think that also degrades the environment that happens in question period that Ms. Khaled described?
Thank you for the question. And I remember a debate that you and I had, Ms. Rempel-Garner, some time ago in a late show. I think it was quite emotional for both of us talking about this very issue and how we could all rise above. And I think it's incumbent on every single one of us to frame our questions in a way that are respectful, but also frame answers in a way that's respectful. I feel like I always do try to do that. I'm not going to try and make this partisan about the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition, because I really want to talk about how we as individuals can rise above.
On that, I'm not going to get into tu quoque cui here, like who did what. You didn't name a lot of people. I do think that I have not shared my experiences because I don't want that to be my Google search. I'm not saying that sharing the experience is invalid, but we need to drive to solutions here. And number one, I would just respectfully ask that, going back to your caucus, maybe say, like, when the opposition asks for information, the line, "that is misinformation," is not productive, one. Two, a lot of this has to do, a lot of me behind the scenes, and I don't want to share my experience publicly, but I've actually had scenarios where charges have been laid and somebody has been released on bail immediately and then disappeared. And then these were death threats. So I have to walk around wondering where this person is. Do you think bail reform to prevent, because we know that like online harassment, and it's not just us, it's every woman in the country, right? Like when the RCMP said MPs need more protection, I'm like, if they can't protect me, how do they protect everyone else? And we know that women see escalation in this type of violence. Do you think that the sort of catch and release policy that allows people where there's repeated harassment to just be released on bail, and then in some instances murder or commit violence against women, do you think that that should be reformed?
If I may. First and foremost, through you, Chair, I acknowledge the hard work and the integrity of Ms. Rempel-Garner. I know how much she goes through on a regular basis, and whether you can share it or not, I acknowledge it, and I'm very, very sympathetic towards it. I think the study of why we're here today is about the conduct between members of Parliament. And I think that it would be great if we could provide solutions on that specifically. And the one that I had proposed in my opening
On that,
remarks,
have either of you received or pressed charges for criminal harassment against any other member of Parliament?
No.
Okay. So then I think a lot of what I've heard and where this comes from is online harassment from the general public, bots, we don't know. So how do we get to a solution on that? Because frankly, I'm tired of the perpetual story I've had for 15 years, which is how do you live with violence against women in politics? I'm sure you both feel the same way. So let's go to solutions. I'm suggesting bail reform. I'd like to get in other areas as well, too, like the fact that repeated harassment, the government hasn't moved to look at any sort of way where repeated harassment, that there's no tools for law enforcement to perhaps get the identity of somebody online. It's a slow and onerous process that allows for escalation of violence. Do you have any solutions on this type of harassment, either bail reform or this, that the committee could consider?
So on that, I have made reports to the police, and when I have, on some occasions, I've been asked what I would like the police to do. On other occasions, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I was told it didn't rise to the level. So I do feel that there's a disconnect between what we received. I do want to make a comment, though, on serial harassers, that and I know the members from Alberta, I'm from Ontario. I will talk about Ontario. It's provincially appointed judges who are making bail decisions. Ontario jails are overrun, and judges are hesitant to send people to provincially, not federally run facilities. It's a complicated issue. We did bring forward a bill which was supported by all parties on bail reform, but I do think we should focus on what we can do as individuals on MP to MP harassment, and not, there are broader conversations to be had about the criminal justice system in general.
Thanks very much, Ms. Rempel-Garner and Ms. Damoff. Colleagues, I am going to be a little bit more generous and flexible just in terms of allowing the questions to be asked and the answers to those questions to be given in order to ensure that we're respecting the sensitivity of the conversation. This will go on both sides, of course, of the table. But we're going to try to stay tight to our time as best as possible. With that, Ms. Romanato, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank my colleagues for being here today and for sharing what they've been going through. That I think pretty much every female member of Parliament has been subject to. I have 2 questions, so I just want to premise this with, I'm sure you're aware that currently the members of the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy does not apply for harassment between member to member. It is a loophole. So right now, a member of Parliament who is being harassed by another member of Parliament has no venue or no recourse, and we're trying to close that. I want to talk a little bit, and I'd like to hear your feedback. Ms. Damoff, you mentioned that when you go out you're concerned for your physical safety. Have you taken steps when you're out at an event for your own safety? Could you describe if you have and what those would be?
Thank you for the question. And through you, Chair, yes, I have, and I appreciate all that the House of Commons has done in terms of offering, the panic buttons, doing security assessments. Certainly, the way my community office operates now is very different than it was when I was elected in 2015. The last two events that I hosted, for Canada Day and a family skate, we as MPs have the ability to have a security assessment done. In both cases, they determined that I should have security there. I believe the rules have changed now, but at the time I had to pay for that out of my office budget. And we didn't have any incidents. It was reassuring, though, to know that there was security that was present at those events.
And you both mentioned, and we all have the same, we have our email accounts, we have our online accounts, our Facebook pages, and so on. And often it is parliamentary staff who are receiving those phone calls, receiving those emails, having to respond to them, seeing those posts in the comments. What has that impact had on your staff?
Thank you for the question. It has a significant impact, right? I mean, yes, there are ways in which staff can rely on mental health services provided by the House of Commons, but how often do they take it? For my own office, I give 10 days, no questions asked, mental health days to my staff. Whenever they need to take it, they should. And that is an honor system that we have amongst ourselves. But I've seen some of the things that they have had to deal with. My own social media, I don't check it, I don't monitor it because it's a lot. But my staff do. And it is not fair to them. It is not fair to them to have to be subjected to all of that. I think that we need to do better by our staff, whether it's in our constituency offices or on the Hill, to ensure that their mental health is safe and that we are retaining proper talent, that they're not leaving because they've become so disengaged with the world of politics and how nasty it can get.
So MP Khalid, you mentioned something that it's the first time I'm hearing that, politics of agitation. And so what we heard on Tuesday was that we've seen a lot of hate on social media. A lot of social media sites are not allowing us to report, or when we report it, it's not, when I say report to the platforms themselves, it's not taken seriously. The Sergeant at Arms has said that, X or Twitter won't even take their calls anymore. I myself have, after sitting in PROC, received a death threat on my social media because of a comment that was made in committee. So given the fact that our online presence is paid for by taxpayers, with respect to whether we're boosting posts and things like that, or having social media accounts, it was suggested that perhaps members of Parliament should also have an online code of conduct in terms of, as you said, politics of agitation. Whereas the member of Parliament may not necessarily be personally attacking you, but the content that they're putting is put on there with the intent to crank, to get that machine going, the Twitter army. What would your recommendations be on how do we tackle this?
It's a very good question, and you know what? I went through this myself last week, where a member of the Ethics Committee, Mr. PROC, tweeted out against me, like just very, very strange tweet, which resulted in agitation. And it was deliberate, it was malicious. And, I like to say that common sense perhaps is not that common, right? We are expected to be held to a higher standard between ourselves and how we conduct ourselves as members of Parliament, who we represent, how we represent them. And so if we need to start legislating our own conduct, how can we expect Canadians to do better? So yes, perhaps legislation is in order now. Perhaps a code of conduct needs to be included in members of Parliament's code of conduct going forward, because this is not right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Madame Gaudreau, je passe la parole à vous pour...
Ms. Goudreau, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. What courage. Dear colleague, what courage. If I may, before I get to the few questions I have, just to explain, and again, it's not the first time I'm saying this, but to what extent I am ashamed. I'm ashamed of us. I belong to this. I have the sense that what is taking place, and some don't want to hear, they're not listening to the interpretation, but I hope that it does trickle down. Right now, we're really taking a deep look at ourselves, because there's so many elements that we could point to. And what outrages me so much, and that is the right word, is that even though the majority of people will say, of course, this is intolerable, this is unacceptable, but inside, and as part of our very institution, how is it that this is taking place today? How is it possible that we accept to tolerate that? And let me explain. So this looking inside means what? What is missing? Is it on behalf of achieving gain, power, and its partisanship, which is able to take a great deal? But what is respect? And today we're speaking about harassment. Harassment, and there I've heard words, and again I'm thinking about interpreters who had to translate these words into French, are completely unacceptable. It's urgent to act, and I think that all of the institution will be in complete agreement. This said, however, I'm still hearing comments saying to us, who is poisoning and contributing to the collateral damage of what can be done when we have permission to speak and to be respected? So, to our witnesses, I'd like to ask this question. Saying words is one thing. They have an impact on social networks, but to be threatened, to receive death threats, it's unacceptable. But when we're speaking about harassment, can a kind of behavior, such as not being listened to, often that occurs, that is, we roll our eyes and we smile because we disrespectfully, or we move away, not to incite the person who's often a woman. So am I the only one who experiences that, or is that something that you also commonly experience? These aren't necessarily words, and I'd like to hear you speak to that.
Thank you very much for that. And it's been an honor to serve with you and to travel with you and know and appreciate that when the cameras are off, we have good relationships with one another. I remember I bought Michael Barrett a piece of cake for his birthday. I remember Melissa Lantzman brought me a fillet of fish one day when I was very hungry and it was pretty late at night. We are capable of having good, strong relationships with each other because when the cameras are off, they exist. Those relationships absolutely exist. When the cameras are off, we are able to get through committee work and get out consensus reports and work on the important issues. So I think maybe the problem is the camera or the fact that that we have the ability to spread so much so fast using social media. And I think those are questions that this committee should be asking experts as you continue with this study.
If I could just add, I think the algorithms on social media, the algorithms on social media that push the angry social media to the top, and the positive or even just policy-related social media posts don't get the same kind of engagement. I think that plays into what we as politicians post, and so the angry, aggressive type of things that get posted, that in turn drive the public to contact MPs, does play a big role in it. So I see a huge difference in the kind of engagement that I get versus a Facebook Live from an MP calling Liberals corrupt, which gets shared 500,000 times. I don't get anywhere near that when I post about a Young Women in Leadership program, or something like being really proud to have supported Len Weber's private member's bill on organ donation. That kind of goes nowhere, whereas the angry, aggressive social media goes straight to the top because of the algorithms.
Madame Gaudreau, il reste seulement quelques
Et
secondes.
en terminant,
Ms. Gaudreau, you have a few seconds left. Mr. Chair, I have 2 minutes 30. But as we look inside, I'd like to say that when there's consensus among the parties and that we accept unacceptable behavior, I hear connivance there, and I hope that you have understood what I'm trying to express. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Gaudreau.
The floor is yours for 6 minutes.
I'm often amazed by colleagues in this place, for good or for bad. Today, you have shown incredible strength, and I am grateful for that. This is actually one of the reasons why I was so adamant about having this study, and so grateful that we could get to it. You did mention, and I want to pick up on MP Demoff, you had talked about that social media piece, those algorithms. Oftentimes, it's seen as the individual's responsibility to police on social media, and yet there is a role, of course, for what we're seeing in terms of the social giants and their responsibility, the money that they make. The Sergeant of Arms actually, even in the last committee meeting, stated that when they were trying to address specific issues with Twitter, they had at one point had connections. They no longer have those. What can we do as part of that, as legislators, to address that better? Do you think, I think building off of what Ms. Romanato had said in terms of a code of conduct online, are there things that maybe we need to do in terms of our internal security systems that have to do with monitoring that or policing that a bit?
I do think a code of conduct would be helpful. I don't know that there would be consequences. I know when I heard at the last meeting the description of harassment as it applies elsewhere, and cyberbullying was one of them. But I also think we as individuals need to think twice before we're posting something that we know is going to incite an organization like the gun lobby. When you deliberately post something that stirs up that kind of anger in public. And I will say that being on the ethics committee has been an eye-opener for me in terms of the number of times that I've been called corrupt and a criminal, and it's actually quite shocking. So, it goes beyond just what the policies are, but individual attacks which stir up the public. The social media companies do bear responsibility on this. Even when we could report, I can remember reporting tweets that were horrific, and getting a message back saying it didn't contravene our community standards. So, there is some responsibility there with social media companies, not just for MPs, but for every Canadian that gets subjected to abuse online.
Piece, of course, though, and that's what we're trying to also deal with here, understanding our role within this. A lot of my colleagues have said that when they've tried to report these incidences, or they have, and I would like to know about your examples that you gave, what your experience was, that there were clear links to far-right extreme organizations pumping it up, the Rebel News media outlets, the Proud Boys as examples, and the links that police found if they were investigated. Did you find that in both of your experiences?
So I've had right-wing extremist members stalk my office, hang out in front of
Rappel au
my
règlement,
office.
Monsieur le Président. J'ai
Sorry,
beaucoup
Ms.
souci
Kelly,
de
just
nos
one
A point of order. I was listening to the interpreters, and apparently two microphones are open at the same time, so perhaps they aren't able to hear the comments made. Just a moment. We're going to try and see what is taking place.
Okay, Madame Gaudreau, on va.
Ms. Gaudreau, we're going to resume. If there's an issue, please let us know in a few seconds, and then we're going to continue with Ms. Khaled. Go ahead, Madame Ms. Khaled.
Saying I've had members of right-wing extremist organizations that have stalked my office, that have shared my home address amongst each other, laughed, obviously, called me a lot of names verbally, videotaped me while I'm walking around in my community, etc. There's definitely a link. And when I talk about the politics of agitation, that's exactly it. I gave the example of when I had tabled Motion 103, where the Conservative Party leadership used my motion to raise funds for themselves by spreading deliberate misinformation. It was specifically that they leveraged a lot of these organizations to come and raise the alarm and raise the agitation amongst Canadians, to pit Canadian against Canadian. So there's definitely a role here and a link between members of Parliament and how the information is spread and used for own political gains.
Ms. Matheson, there's just a couple of seconds left in your round here.
I'll bank it then.
Okay, sounds good. Ms. Rempel-Garner, it's over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to be clear with my two colleagues here. You aren't suggesting that the Liberal Party hasn't made statements that have agitated people in the past, right? You admit that's happened.
I think every MP needs to look at what they've done, Michelle. So I'm not going to say the Liberal Party, but I will say that there have been instances when individuals in my party have done things.
So I asked this to prove a point, because where we can't get to a point is, like, if you two aren't willing to say that the Liberals have not engaged in this behavior, I have been on the receiving end of what you have described, but what your members have done. So what we can't get into when we're talking about solutions is pretending that one party is above scrutiny, right? And so to avoid that, I would suggest that the solutions need to be oriented towards using what is in law for criminal harassment, hate speech, and where there are gaps in that prevent not just us, any Canadian, from accessing justice or de-escalating these types of behavior, that we go there. Would you agree with that principle, that any forward solution on this can't be governed by a partisan body?
I absolutely agree.
Okay.
And in my remarks, I even said that it's not all Conservative. And I can only, and my colleague can only speak to what we've experienced, Ms. Rempel-Garner. We can't speak to what you or Ms. Ferreri or anyone else has experienced. I can only speak about what's happened to me and the impact that has been a direct result of a Conservative MP. I can't speak to anything that anyone else
But
has
you wouldn't
experienced.
suggest that the Prime Minister is directly responsible for the harassment I've received, would you?
I've been trying to stay above the fray because I'm not getting into whether the opposition leader or the Prime Minister. I mean, if you want to go there, we can. But I really would prefer not to.
Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is that solutions have to be objective and not be governed by, and I have concerns that a code of conduct that would be governed by a partisan body or a quasi-partisan body wouldn't get to that point. So, for recommendations, would you support a recommendation, particularly going into the next federal election, where intimate images that are created by deepfake technology, that those types of images would be applied to the same criminal code sanctions that are in the criminal code right now for sort of traditional intimate images?
I'm not a lawyer, so I'll just give my own personal opinion. I know you've done a lot of work, a lot more than I have on AI and that type of thing, but absolutely.
Okay. The other thing I was thinking of was that there needs to be a mechanism by which, when there's repeated harassing behavior that has gotten to a point where, a court of justice sees or there's a summary conviction, that there's a clear instance of repeated harassment, that law enforcement should be able to go under some sort of an order and obtain the identity of somebody from a social media platform so that charges could be laid. Right now there's gray area in the law. Would you recommend something like that?
So when the Ethics Committee actually went to the RCMP last week and got a whole training session on their digital forensic, and that's an issue that they raised with us.
Okay, so we need some legislation on that. The other thing is, when there's clear instances of repeated harassing behavior online, and we're not talking about like a single mean tweet or something here, but like there's somebody who's clearly repeatedly harassing somebody, threatening, obscene, whatever the definition is, that there needs to be some sort of intervention available to the Court of Justice so that that person is directed to stop communicating with somebody. That doesn't exist right now. Would you recommend that that's something that the government should be looking into at this point in time?
Yes, and actually Julie Lalonde is a witness in the next panel. I think she'd be a good person to ask those questions to. She has a lot of experience on that.
Thank you. And again, like, the reason why I'm looking at objective solutions is that, I could sit here and talk about members of the Liberal Party that I've had to block on social media, but because they have sent hordes after me, right? I just think that if we get into a situation where we are censoring speech, particularly where we are saying the government's position is the positive position that needs to be uploaded, and that criticism of the government is downloaded in a legitimate situation, that we're doing democracy a disservice. Not saying there isn't a problem with what you and me and others have received. I'm just trying to look at objective solutions. So would you recommend in that scenario that we look at strengthening or closing loopholes that are in existing criminal justice laws that prevent law enforcement from intervening at early stages that allow this behavior to escalate into, hate speech, threats of violence, or actual violence?
Colleagues, just I've let that question go about 60 seconds over, so a quick response. I'm sorry to rush.
Yes.
Well, Ms. Damoff, that was exemplary in terms of quick. Thank you very much. Thanks, Ms. Rempel-Garner. Mr. Erskine-Smith, we turn the floor over to you for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. And Ikra Pam, thanks for your testimony. The comments that you read out are, absolutely shameful. And I guess where it might be more constructive to spend time is when it comes to member versus member harassment. And we obviously have a code for sexual harassment, and there's no place for that, and that's rightly in place. We at the same time, though, have rules in the chamber related to privilege, where we wouldn't have a defamation action that could be brought, for example, because of comments that are spoken in the House of Commons. And we privilege free speech of members in representing their constituents to a very high degree. And how do you see balancing that idea of privilege and the ability to voice concerns, and in some cases voice them so in such a problematic way that it might rise to defamation in the House, but it's not actionable? How do you see squaring that with members' code of conduct as vis-a-vis members around harassment?
I'll start. Thank you for that question. Really appreciate it. As I had said in my opening remarks, members should not be allowed to do indirectly what they cannot do directly. And the Code of Conduct for Members of Parliament is very, very clear about how we should be conducting ourselves, what we should be allowed to say in the House or not. And we have the wherewithal, we have the freedom to be able to represent our constituents and to raise the voices that our constituents need us to raise. But at the same time, I think strengthening or perhaps really clarifying that rule that you cannot do indirectly what you can't do directly would be a good starting point. And as members have suggested as well, to create a clear code of conduct online as well and members' social media. Look, the thing is that we are and should be held to a higher standard. And we need to make sure that our actions are parliamentary. And I think there's always that gut check, right? When you know what you've done is not parliamentary. I know that I have, and I admit to it, deleted tweets that I have found afterwards I wasn't too comfortable with. So I think, one, we need to check ourselves. Two, if we can't check ourselves, we need to clarify the rules of code of conduct for members of parliament.
Pam, do you have anything else you want to add?
That's fine, Nate. Through you, Chair, sorry.
About 2 minutes left, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
Thanks. Do you worry at all about, I mean, this place is a circus at the best of times, and it can be even more of a circus when things go on too long, where we haven't had constituency weeks and we enter June and all that. Do you worry at all? You look at what's happening to the Speaker right now, and there are certain rules that then people stand on those rules and they turn those rules into an even greater circus. Do you worry at all that if there's a harassment policy in place that, that in turn becomes just another tool for another procedural tool in some ways for a member to go at another member and to say, you said this and I'm going to say it's harassment and turn it into a circus in its own right?
Good question. Perhaps. I will say there's 338 of us in this House. We are so privileged to be here. And the examples that we set the tone for every single Canadian. And when Canadians, and I worry about young people in particular, look at what's going on right now, I worry that they look at all of it and throw up their hands and say, well, one is as bad as the other. I don't want anything to do with it. Whether or not a code of conduct could be weaponized, I think we need to look at how we can do it. The same could be said for sexual harassment between members, and we managed to do something on that. So I do think there's a way that that it can be done in a way that is not going to be weaponized.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks. Honestly, to have gone through every member of Parliament deals with different elements of it, but I have never even come close to experiencing anything remotely what you two have gone through, and it's outrageous that anyone would have to listen to and read and experience the things you guys have experienced. So thanks for being here.
Thanks very much, Mr. Erskine-Smith. Colleagues, just before we move on to the final couple of interventions, I do note that we are running a little bit behind schedule. So I would just encourage members to be in touch with their staff or their respective whips offices in the event that they need to be somewhere else. We're probably going to end up, because we have a third panel, going 15 or 20 minutes over time today. So I just wanted to intervene very quickly to give you the courtesy of having some time to address that. Madame Gaudreau, il y a 2 minutes 30 secondes qui restent pour vous. Alors, je passe la...
Ms. Gaudreau, you have 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. From the outset, I'll be brief, but I will take the time to say this slowly. I dare to hope that what we have just seen here, with all of the courage and the honesty and the frankness that we saw, that today, a week from now rather, there won't be partisan mobilization, which might be the outcome of this and could be used as a harmful means, because I've understood that it is even more serious than what I had thought. And I hope that those of you who bear the flag will wear it. We're not going to change something small today only. So I know that earlier I might have not well formulated my question, but essentially it was to understand how far harassment goes in our actions, in our attitude. And the conclusion I draw from this today, that is, there's urgency. It's a serious situation. So when I've heard about the possibility of striking a subcommittee, that will be impartial, because we're going to achieve some progress in maintaining that it's not partisan. And if somebody says, sure, we're not looking for power, we can make sure that, yes, there will be neutrality so that we can set the example. And I don't think that it's a 180 turn, but we need a 360-degree turn. In closing, I have one remaining question to Ms. Demoff. Could we imagine one day that a man who has been subjected to harassment would have done what you have dared to do? That is because it's not possible to tolerate, and who would have resigned, as you did on May 1st?
You actually give me the opportunity to talk about a double standard that I've seen when I brought this up at Ethics Committee. I was called a pearl clutcher and labeled as being hysterical, and that it was the price to pay for being a federally elected official. And then earlier this month, a former Conservative MP testified and talked about the way that he got harassed online, and he was called a hero by his Conservative colleagues. And I will say it's disheartening that women who speak out, and I'm sure my friend and colleague here has had the same experience, are called pearl clutchers, and men who, Sean Fraser has told me he doesn't experience anything near to what I've experienced online since I first got elected. So there is a difference in the way that women and men are treated, and I think how they respond to the type of comments and abuse that we get.
Thank you.
Je vous remercie beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, du temps que vous m'avez accordé.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to thank you for the additional time you have given me. Thank you.
Half and change. Over to you.
Thank you. There is absolutely a double standard, and it is interesting. I'm often told, you have to have a thick skin, to work up in Parliament, but you signed up for it, and I'm sure that we all agree that you did not sign up for this. I wanted to quickly get to, you talked a lot about the impacts of your staff. I know that we We rely upon them so much, and they are so integral to all the work that we do, and they are incredible. I worry about mine, and I worry about the supports that we have in place through administration. So have you put your minds to any additional supports that you would like to see for your staff who have to deal with a lot of this as well?
Thanks for that question. I don't think our staff get enough credit for the work that they do. None of us in this room could do the work we do without the staff that support us. I sent my speech to a former staffer to read over last night, and when she responded, she said, the individual said, "Thank you for saying all of this. It made my heart jump a bit with anxiety as I feel it again, even though I left some time ago." It was traumatizing, and it is traumatizing for staff, especially with repeated phone calls into the community office. I'm sure you get that in London as well. And as Ms. Khaled was saying, reading through the emails, and I don't think there's enough support for them. I think the House of Commons does as much as they, or has done a lot, and I know they're aware of the issue. They've done de-escalation training for staff so that they hopefully have the tools to be able to de-escalate these calls. But it's pretty intimidating. Most of our staff are young people, and it's pretty intimidating, especially for the ones on the front line in the community, to be faced with this at the door of your office or on the phone, because a lot of times these people who call, they call repeatedly. They hide their phone numbers so that you can't, you don't know who's calling. I've explicitly said not to answer phone calls from outside our area code because a lot of times those calls are abusive, and quite frankly, if someone lives in a different area code, they're not my constituent likely. So, and if they are, they can leave a message. But I think our staff are really underlooked in what happens in our offices.
Can I just very quickly add to that? Everything that Pam said, Ms. Demoff said, is accurate. I would make a very quick plug. Our staff don't get paid enough to deal with the things that they deal with. If you guys can help us in paying our staff better wages, I think we'd be able to help support them a lot better as well.
Thank you very much to everybody. Ms. Ferreri, the floor will be yours for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Excuse me. Pardon my voice. Thank you for having me here today. Excuse me. And thank you to our two witnesses. It is certainly a story to be a person in politics and then add the woman in front of it. It is different. And, you know, I appreciate the testimony. I've always joked. I said, imagine we started a mean tweets, you know, like Jimmy Kimmel used to do, and we all, as MPs from every party, just read them. You know, one of the things that it popped up, and my colleague really eloquently positioned this, and it's that legitimate criticism versus harassment. And I think there's a lot around that, because it is our job, as she has mentioned, in opposition, to ensure that we're holding that line, and, you know, people don't feel heard. And I guess one of the questions I would ask you is, a lot of those messages you read in particular, Pam, they were, you know, they were pretty graphic. They were from the public. They weren't from other members. But do you think those people that write those things are doing okay?
So they were sent to me, though, through you, Chair. They were sent to me as a result of the action of another member of Parliament. So it wasn't anything I had done. It wasn't necessarily policy related. But in answer to your question, though, I do think since the pandemic, I have found it's gotten much worse since the pandemic, and I do think that a lot of people are struggling with mental health and are struggling dealing with threats, whether it's to their health, to their safety, whether to what's going on around the world. So I do think that there are a lot of people, and I also want to say, too, that the vast majority of Canadians are good and decent people who do not treat other people in this way, but it's becoming more and more prevalent in society.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I think what people say online versus what they say to your face are very different. They're very, very different things. Just to retract then, so you're saying that those messages that you read into the record today, they were directly linked to an MP's comments, or they were just random messages to you?
They came to, so look, I have had over my 9 years, almost 9 years as an MP, thousands of just horrific messages. The examples I gave, though, most of them were the result of the actions of an MP posting something, which then resulted in a flood directly related to what that individual had posted.
Okay, thank you. I think sometimes, too, I think it is important to say policies. Like, I think sometimes there's policies that make people feel unheard or unseen, and I'm not excusing it. Listen, I'm on the same end. I have, criminal charges against people who've threatened to kill myself as well. But I think sometimes it's, to your point, if people don't feel heard, right? I think that is a piece of the puzzle, and Ms. Rempel-Garner touched on this greatly. And I would suggest that recommendation. The biggest thing I get told is nobody answers a question in question period, and people, and you have the worst food insecurity in history. You have you have a mental health crisis, you have suicide rates, you have all of these things. And I don't justify people's hateful behavior, but there's always a reason why somebody is doing what they're doing. And so I think on a bigger scale, when we look at raising our children and knowing, you can't say that to somebody's face, so don't say it online, And so I think when we're making these recommendations, I think it is great to go back to sort of the criminal piece of it. One of the things that's come up a lot in my work is the Victims' Bill of Rights. A lot of people feel that criminals have more rights in this country than victims. And in 2020, there was an ask by the Office of the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime, asked for a parliamentary review of the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights, citing top 4 issues that needed to be addressed. And it's never been addressed. It's never happened. And so I guess my question to you is twofold. Where do you see that? Should that be re-examined? Would you suggest something like that as well?
Can I share with you? So a couple of months ago, MP Michael Barrett had started a Facebook Live in which he had called my colleague and I corrupt, released our emails, etc., which led to a whole bunch of hate coming towards me, people calling, people emailing on social media, etc. But there was this one lady, Peggy. She drove 2 hours to my constituency office, and she was very, very upset, asking me why I was a corrupt individual. Why am I shutting down committees? Why am I not allowing investigations to happen? Why do I think it's okay for us to XYZ? I sat down with her. We had a conversation for about half an hour. And she gave me the biggest hug when she left. And I think to me that really proves a point. When I talk about the politics of agitation, it is that spreading or framing an issue in a way that really does agitate people, that makes them anxious. It adds an extra layer to whatever they're dealing with on a daily basis as it is. So I think that we as members of parliament have a responsibility to be more fair in how we engage in social media.
Sorry, so just to clarify, do you think the Victims' Bill of Rights needs to be amended?
So on that, I've got a meeting with the ombudsperson for the victims of crime. I've met with the office in the past. They reminded me that most people who are in jail are also victims of abuse. So, I think any of our policies, whether it's the Victims' Bill of Rights or several other things that we deal with, it's always a good thing to take a look at them. But I think we need to bear in mind, and if you've met with that individual, the ombudsperson, you'll know that they have a very balanced approach to victims.
Thanks very much, Ms. Namoff. Okay, the last intervention for this panel will be you, Ms. Romanato, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So I wanted to go back to something you said, MP Damoff, with respect to, we already have a system in place with respect to the code of conduct for members dealing with sexual harassment. And in that code of conduct, there's a mechanism, and it is not political parties that are involved. This is literally, there are professionals with Human Resources Office that deals with complaints and mediation and so on and so forth. So we know a model already exists. So as it was indicated in Appendix A of the workplace harassment policy that unfortunately doesn't apply between MPs, it gives examples of behaviors that can be considered harassment. Would you say that it would be pretty easy for us to implement the harassment policy between MPs because we already have a model in which complaints can be brought forward, but also an example of lists of behaviors that would not be acceptable, but also I think would be helpful, and I'd like your opinion on this, mediation or reconciliation. And when I say that, for instance, if there is a member who is being targeted online by another member, which then indirectly gets the harassment going, if there was a mechanism where you could invite that member of parliament to a meeting with a professional, with a human resources, with a mediation officer to say, look, I'm not sure if you realize that what you're doing is causing a lot of hurt. It's creating this mass of hate and so on. Because there is no mechanism and we have a very adversarial job that we already do, would you recommend that maybe we have systems in place so that we can actually bring our colleagues together and say, look, this behavior is not acceptable and I need you to help stop it? What would you recommend? I'm trying to talk about not the indirect hate, but how can we prevent getting there?
I think the mechanism you've described would be helpful. I hate to say anything is easy to do, but yes, I do. I do think that would be helpful.
Okay, and with respect to the impact on families, my family looks at my page, right, and I try to put a lot of positive things out. I don't do the personal attacks. I just really put out a lot of positive stuff. But when I get the comments, I know my dad would call and say, Sherry, like, do they even know you? Like, you're such a nice person. Why are people saying that about you? It's very hurtful for our families to see that. And I have people come up to me saying, I've seen some of the stuff people, like, do they even know you? You're a nice person, right? I don't think people realize when that's happening, our families are affected as well. So then when you're having that conversation on whether you're going to run again or whether you're going to continue doing what you're doing, a lot of time the family is saying, look, do you really want to keep putting up with that? And it impacts our ability to do what we do. I know I self-regulate in the chamber now. There are times I want to get up and ask a question. I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to. You know why? Because it's just going to invite the hate. So my privilege is actually being taken away because I self-regulate. I decide what parts of the debate I'm going to participate in because I just don't want to invite it. Would you say that's something that's happening as well?
Sorry. I'm pretty sure my son is watching right now. He's 34 years old. He's not a little kid. And I know that what happens to me here bothers him a lot more than it bothers me. And it has an impact on him and his family. I worry about our family's safety. You know, I don't have young kids living at home anymore, but I do worry about MPs who have young kids who are subjected to abuse. But it does. In 2018, my son called out someone who had attacked me online, and in the Oakville Beaver, actually, our local newspaper, which doesn't really exist anymore, but did a story about it, about the bullying of MPs in politics. But I do know that it has a huge impact on our families. and that's across party lines. But it also, I think, weighs into what we do and don't do. I actually sent him my speech last night, and then I said, don't read it, because I figured it would be better if he only heard it once and didn't read it ahead of time. But I think it's harder on our families than it is for us as individuals, and I think that you're correct that it does impact what we do and don't do in the House, in anticipation of what might happen out in the real world.
Thank you very much, Ms. Damoff. Colleagues, this brings us to the end of the second panel. I do just want to take a moment, and as I look around the table and online, and I want to thank Ms. Rempel, Garner, Ferreri, Matheson, Khalid, Demov, Romanado, and Gaudreau in particular, because I do appreciate that life in politics, as difficult as it is certainly more